Hey everybody, welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. It's that podcast where we take a look at every single Best Picture winner in random order and try to figure out which one is the best. This week we are talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from 1975, starring Jack Nicholson, directed by Milos Forman. It's a pretty interesting movie based on a book that a couple of us have read, and well, we're going to talk about it, but first we got to do a little housekeeping. That's right, last week we were talking about Dances with Wolves from 1990, and that ended up not exactly in the first half of our list. In fact, it ended up at 19th place out of 29 films. So, well, that's pretty far down the second half. You know, it was an interesting movie, and we had some good discussion about it. And it ended up where it ended up. But today, we're going to be discussing, among other things, the performance of Jack Nicholson. I think is something to mention. And well, I don't know if we're really going to talk about the adaptation here. I don't really think it matters too much. But pretty interesting movie. Tucker, why don't you give us a little synopsis so that we know what's going on? And Quest viewers, I just want to say this: we haven't really mentioned it in previous episodes of the podcast, but if you are watching along, I think that will enhance your experience of this quite a bit, because not only can you hear our thoughts, but you can think your thoughts for yourself and imagine yourself sitting in this Zoom room together chatting about the film. I mean, doesn't that sound like a wonderful free thought?
I can't even process that.
Okay, well, Tucker, what happens in this film? What's the bare bones of it?
So, all right, don't put too much pressure on me. It's my first time. I'm kind of new to this, but basically, what you got is good old Randall Patrick McMurphy, played by Jack Nicholson, who's just a scumbag. He's just an asshole. He's literally a criminal. He's literally a child rapist, like a bunch of stuff, and he is crazy. Maybe he's just an asshole. And he is sent from a prison to workplace to mental institution to have someone deal with him being such a weirdo. And he gets stuck in the ward run by Mildred Ratched, played by Louise Fletcher, who is an overbearing, somewhat pretty manipulative ward owner. I don't know what ward
nurse.
Woman. Nurse, sure, yeah, we'll go with that one. And he is surrounded by a gang of wacky individuals, played by a whole host of iconic actors and playing great roles. And they are just trying to have a good time. And R.P. McMurphy ends up dying at the end, and has electricity shot through his branicle. And it's a pretty interesting movie, as you said, adapted from a book that I have read. But I want to know what you guys think of it, because personally, I don't have a ton to say, to be honest.
I
didn't do very good there. Sorry, guys. That was not great.
I think that was a good synopsis, because now I know who the characters are, and well, at least the important ones to begin with.
I watched this movie several years ago. I very much enjoyed it. Over the years, my opinion sort of waned on it. But on a rewatch, I'm right back up there, baby. I really enjoyed this one. I think it's brilliant filmmaking. I think it's brilliantly performed. I think if you delve into the thematic material behind it, it's even more brilliant. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Abram, your thoughts?
I don't know. This is, I think, one of the first times I've come to Quest without really knowing how I feel about a film. And the issue, the root of the issue for me is I'm not really sure why. While watching the film, having not read the book, I should note, it's immaculately acted. There is such tension. There are incredibly long sequences of just dialogue that are very gripping. The film is so cleverly written. Jack Nicholson is such a revelation, I think, as Mac. But I finished the movie and it was head empty, no thoughts, I suppose. I just, something about it didn't click for me. And I'm not sure if it's because the plot felt a little bit meandering, if it's because the side characters felt underdeveloped to me. But something about it, in spite of how I think compelled the performances are and how inventive a lot of the film is, it just didn't quite work for me.
Interesting. So Tucker and I are the ones who've read the book, right?
Correct.
Yes. I like this quite a lot. I liked the book when I read it, and I found myself thinking about the adaptation a bit. But as I said in the intro, I'm not entirely sure that this was a book really matters when we're thinking about this film. I think it is very well constructed. There's elements that are missing that I think in spots where maybe I agree, Abram, parts don't quite flesh out. I'm like, oh, I know the backstory of these characters, and these characters are fleshed out because I remember how they were written about in the book. But of course, that's not in the movie. And so some of that, but I think, I mean, if we're just gonna say it, I'm gonna give a hot take right here. Jack Nicholson is a really good actor.
What?
Deserving
Hold
of
on,
that
back
Best
up
Actor
here.
award that he won for this performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I'm totally drawn in by him. His charisma, even though Tucker's so right that he's just an asswipe. I mean, he's not a good dude, but you root for him anyway because he's like, ooh, and he's like trying to get something. And he's trying to hype up all the rest of the guys as he calls them, and
The boys.
And all the shenanigans that he pulls are interesting and fun to watch. As well as I think that Tanner, you're right. It has some greater thematic meaning to it. That is interesting to watch from a modern perspective. This to cut it short, he's lobotomized at the end.
Yes.
Which is horrifying to think about.
Mm-hmm. So I did want to talk about. Let's delve into Jack Nicholson here, Jackie boy. Yeah. Okay. So,
What?
I was trying to do a Jack Nicholson impression. You know how he is in this movie. He's like, I think a couple of the guys they want to watch baseball.
Like he's
how he
hearing
is.
the call.
Yeah, you know how he is. But we are correct in saying that while he is likable, he's the protagonist of the story. He is also an incredible asshole, as like we've been saying. But you have to wonder why you're so attracted to him, why you latch onto him as a protagonist, and that is because of the thematic material of the movie. I believe is that he represents sort of individuality and freedom. He's coming into I forget the name of the institution, but he's coming into the hospital. Probably not being actually crazy, just kind of like putting it on to get out of work, like it stated before. But he is introduced to us as this sort of freewheeling spirit. He has fun. He has jokes. He's joking around with everybody. He's setting up gambling rings, and he's sort of juxtaposed with Louise Fletcher as Nurse Ratched, who is herself incredibly manipulative and regimented, but also represents institutionalization and the restraining of individuality and freedom and choice. And that is why audiences are naturally going to gravitate towards Jack Nicholson in this film.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tucker, I do believe you gave us a synopsis, but I didn't get to quite hear what you thought about the film right off the bat.
Well, I feel like I mentioned, and I guess I'll just repeat myself. I wasn't clear. I think this is a very good movie. I'm kind of on the same page as Abram. It's sort of a head empty moment for me. I really want to get more into this as we're discussing it further through this review. But I do think it's a good movie. I just can't exactly say that a lot of it is impactful to me outside of Jack Nicholson's performance, because I think that the connection of thematic material, you're right, Tanner, but I think that it's really the nuance of his performance that connects you to him.
Obviously that too.
I know you weren't denying that. I was agreeing with you.
Okay. Well, you said it's this and also this, and you're correct. We're both correct.
So
I want to jump in here for a second. I want to stir up some mud because Tanner, I got to push back on what you're saying, and it's starting to come into focus why I don't think I was as compelled by the film.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think the thematic material is all that deep. I don't think there's a lot to latch on to there. I think it's pretty obvious from the first moment when he's asked to take the medicine, right, and they won't tell him what's in it, that it's pretty clear the tension being set up, right? I don't necessarily think a film needs a really deep thematic material to be compelling, even though I really enjoy theme. But I think that this is pretty surface level, I think, in the tension set up. And because of that, I think that the strength of the film instead becomes Jack Nicholson. And I think Jack Nicholson carries the film for the duration of the time that you're watching it and sells, as we were texting about earlier, the just absurd and excellent dialogue that he has, right? But at the same time, part of my issue, I think, with the film is that in retrospect, the thematic material does feel pretty surface level, and I don't really think anybody other than him is brought into pretty clear focus. Everybody else is like an amorphous group of people that represent an idea, but then are given more development like Billy or Chief, but ultimately it doesn't really feel like it has been set up properly and doesn't quite feel earned, in my opinion, the ending. I think this movie entirely lives and dies by Jack Nicholson, and it lives pretty large when you're watching the film, but I just don't know what impact it leaves in the face of pretty shallow material surrounding him.
I would say it's not the thematic depth that gives the themes of this movie strength. It's the universality of the themes, the easily applicable. And you're right, they have to be shallow to be applicable to this level. But that individuality and chaos, even to an extent, of Jack Nicholson's character, in the face, rising up in the face of Nurse Ratched's manipulation and regiment.
I think that this film also could be viewed, you could take the thematic material, but you could also take it at an even simpler and even surface level of a commentary on mental health care in America.
I mean, yeah.
That I think it has a lot to say about that is relevant, and, saying that oftentimes people in the institutions, shouldn't be there. Maybe not oftentimes, but there are people who shouldn't be there, and that the people who are there aren't being treated well at all. Are they actually being given therapy, or are they just being forced to reopen their wounds on a daily basis by some evil woman? And so that I think is an interesting thing to think about, as well as that. I mean, Jack Nicholson's character, R.P. McMurphy, is very multi-layered, and this idea that is he or isn't he insane? Is he a horrible person? Do we like him or do we not? I mean, we do learn that he committed and was convicted of statutory rape, and that's why he went to jail. And so it's like he's likable, but we know that we wouldn't probably like him in real life, and so there's this conflict within the character itself, excluding the performance, that I think comes across very well to me and makes it more enjoyable to see how he goes about his business in the ward.
Yeah. I mean, he is a really nuanced character. I think you're right in terms of the layers. I mean, he's not only a criminal in the regard that you were saying, but like he maybe doesn't even feel bad about that. He just sees what he's doing as having a good time, or being himself, and he's just a compulsive fighter. He's a compulsive gambler. He's always setting up people. He's always poking people. He's pushing back against the system, and maybe that's fun in some situations. Maybe it's dangerous in others. I think it's interesting in some ways how it plays off of the group of people around him, some of which lean more heavily into supporting him with that, or push back against it. But I think his depth as a character is such a highlight that I think, as Abram was saying, it's a little bit underwhelming to see that a lot of the characters around him are relatively one note. And while I really enjoy performances like Martini with Danny DeVito, or Christopher Lloyd as Tabor, because they're funny to get reaction shots from, and they're interesting to see the dialogue and the way they interact with one another, they're not as layered of characters. I think Chief and Harding and Billy are the closest to that, but even then, they're nowhere near, and I think it kind of makes the ensemble cast feel a little bit unbalanced.
I would say that this film maybe isn't bolstering itself as an ensemble, because I think a lot of the other patients, the original patients, sort of operate as a unit that Jack Nicholson and McMurphy and Ratched are fighting for control over. I think one instance where I really captured that idea was it was in two sequences. There's the two voting sequences where they're deciding when to put the World Series on the TV or not. The cinematography and the direction of the camera in that scene is really, in the first one versus the second one, is very interesting. The first one, you see it focuses on Jack Nicholson, and it sort of cuts to the other patients, but it keeps cutting back to Nurse Ratched, symbolizing, of course, that these guys are wary of going against Nurse Ratched. They're shooting looks at her to see what her take on this whole situation is. Juxtaposed with that second voting scene, where the camera flows much more naturally around the group and almost cuts back to Nurse Ratched, I think only at the end. And I think it really captures the evolution of the group as they embrace the individuality and freedom and chaos that McMurphy represents.
I really like in this movie the scenes of chaos, as I will label them. There are a number of them sprinkled throughout. The first one that happens, I think it's the first day in the ward for McMurphy, and all the characters just start yelling at each other, and it's just this cacophonous, like, going back and forth, and there's so many lines going on, and it's all they're all, screaming at the top of their lungs at each other, and it's this totally out of control situation. And then that's replicated later on in the film with the party scene, and it's just like they're all just drunk and crazy, and they've got the the little spigot full of wine, and they're like giving it to the dude, and like
they're giving it to the guy from the original Hills Have Eyes, and Dick Halloran from The Shining is there. It's all a great time.
And it really does illustrate to me like I think the power of chaos in the situation. And as I read it, that McMurphy is an agent of chaos within the structuredness of the ward.
He's like the Joker.
Oh, Christ.
But I do agree with you,
Great
Tanner,
stuff.
that and I think while the filmmaking doesn't like grab attention to itself, it does support what's going on in the story, especially in these very long dialogue sequences, which are difficult to retain interesting, to keep them interesting, to keep them flowing, and not just be like, blah, 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 having two characters talk back and forth at each other for 5 minutes is not always that fun to watch.
I don't necessarily, in my opinion, think it's the strength of the filmmaking as much as the script that makes those sequences so interesting. I think for me, the absolute highlight of the film is the script. The way it's written in these situations it writes itself into are so clever, whether it is just an exchange about Harding's wife, and no, it's not about me, it's about relationships and people and God and the devil and heaven and all of this or whatever.
Oh, it's like Zack Snyder.
Yes.
God damn it.
I think that the script is so confidently just eclectic. It's not particularly linear. It's not particularly sensible, but it's so interesting, and I think that's what makes it compelling. Yeah, I think, Tanner, your observations about the camera work are cool, and I didn't really pick up on those when I was watching. But I'm not sure this is a film that succeeds by being subtle. I think it's a film that succeeds by being bold, and it's in the boldest sequences that the film is most interesting. Whether that's because of the script or because of these big physical sequences, like the boat starting to corkscrew because the guy lets go of the wheel and everyone's running all over the place, and we got a fish and the fish is over here, and Candy is completely naked because we were about to have sex in the cabin, and all of this stuff is happening. Like Timo said, I think it's the moments of chaos where the film is most interesting. But
Yeah, and I think it's... Oh, sorry.
But I just don't know if when the film isn't being chaotic like that, it's nearly as compelling.
Yeah, I think what for me it's the combination of those climaxes, which you have multiple times, of those cacophonous, chaotic, lots of buzzword sequences. But I think for me, it's also with the strength of the script, like you were saying, the lead up to those sequences. The downtime between the lead up to those sequences, I think you're right, can feel a little bit underwhelming. But when miscommunications and confusion are happening between the characters, and you can feel that tension building, is really exciting, and it makes it satisfying and engaging when you do hit those crazy sequences with all the characters, and it gives them a chance to bounce off of one another to see how their personalities react in different situations, and throughout the film, how their confidence levels have changed as a person when they're reacting to all those multiple chaotic situations. And it gives a few of them chances to shine in terms of how their confidence level has changed. So I think for me, the script, Jack Nicholson's performance, and his, as Tanner was saying, manipulation or control of the group that develops over the course of the film combines really well with those tension-building sequences. So I'm always a fan of just when they're sitting around the card table or sitting around whatever, and they're just picking at one another, and someone says something, and it knocks over a domino, and just keeps rolling, snowball rolling, and then you get the crazy thing, and then it crashes. And I think that's where the movie works its best magic.
I do want to applaud. Abrams said something about this film lacking subtlety. But I think one aspect of the film in which subtlety is exuded in spades is in Louise Fletcher's performance as Nurse Ratched. She's often lauded as one of the greatest movie villains of all time. And on a rewatch, I really captured a lot and noticed a lot of the subtlety in her performance. And a lot of the like the gray area and the nuance that is included in there, because it's hard to understand, and it's really interesting to pick apart whether or not she actually believes in the rehabilitation she's engaging in. Does she actually believe that her regimented control of all of her patients will make them better, or is she just a sociopathic manipulator who gains some sort of enjoyment out of controlling all these people? Is it a mix of those two? And I think that conflict or that thought comes out in some very interesting places in her performance.
My problem, because I think that's a very interesting tension, is that I don't think it matters. I think that her actual acting does have that nuance, but ultimately I'm not sure her actions really do, and because of that, I don't think that tension has a lot of actual impact on the narrative. We're talking about the idea of, is Jack Nicholson crazy? Is he not? Right, but that plot becomes subsumed by the institution, which, like that great sequence in the boardroom where they're like, I want to do this with him. I want to do this with him. Mm-hmm. What does he want to do, right? That's pretty obviously the point that other people are not making the decisions for him, right? But I think part of that, and you got that line from Ratched about, we should stop passing the buck, like we should solve our own problems, right? Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, but ultimately, I'm not sure the film has the space to unpack these ideas. It makes a lot of conclusions. I think it tells you, okay, this is the way things are, and it paints the film, I think, as being about institutions. And because of that, and because it's commentary on mental health institutions, there is, as Tanner was alluding to, any real tension between individuality and what have you, I think it doesn't leave a lot of space for Ratched to do anything other than be acted in a way that has a lot of nuance, but not ultimately have any nuanced elements to add to the actual reading of the film.
And I think that's...
Sorry, go ahead, Tucker.
I was just going to say that I actually agree with both of you to some extent. I do think her performance is really good. In my eyes, not necessarily worthy of that Best Actress win that she got. And I don't personally see her as that crazy best villain of all time up there. But I think she's an interesting character in terms of what you might see going on beneath the surface. But I think Abram is right in terms of she doesn't make like a lot of difficult decisions. She doesn't make a lot of different decisions. She kind of just makes the ones that you can predict that she'll make. She acts pretty much the same way in each scenario. And you're like, okay, yeah, I know exactly how she's going to react to this with her stone cold face and just shutting everything down. And it's the fact that doesn't move at all that I think loses some of the nuance of the performance, because even though there's like, you might be able to look behind her eyes and into the cogs of her brain is, okay, how is she thinking about this? It's not really reflected in her actions, like Abram was saying.
I have to push back against that. I think that she does make an incredibly important decision. She makes a pivotal decision in this movie, which is to keep McMurphy on the ward about halfway through the movie.
But again, I think that's a predictable decision for her to make.
Because like, she is a representation of the institution.
And that's my problem right there.
Which is going to squash individuality.
And that's my problem with her character. Her character is not important beyond her representing the institution that she works for. Ratched is only interesting as an extension of something bigger than herself. I think that you have a really compelling performance, and I think you have an interesting character standing for something larger. But the character herself, on just a character level, on the decisions she's making, on the beats she's given, I think they're very much straightforward.
Well, if you would like more Nurse Ratched characterization, I recommend you watch Ratched on Netflix, streaming now.
Jesus Christ. And see, I think that's the thing that's interesting to me. And you were saying that a lot of people, and maybe yourself included, I'm not really sure, consider her to be one of the best, movie villains of all time. And I think through the lens that Abram and I are talking about, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it's crazy that they decided to turn this character, who's just an extension of the institutional issues, into an entire TV show. And I don't know how good the show is. I don't know the critical reception of it.
It's Ryan Murphy, so it's probably not that good.
But I just think it's fascinating that people consider her that highly, because I really just don't see it. Timo, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that Nurse Ratched is an interesting character, and knowing about the book and knowing a little bit more, I do kind of buy in that she, as a representation of the institution, kind of has to be a little bit rigid and a little bit unchanging. The way that if you're going to dive in and you're going to tell the story, but you're going to have this character who is purely representative. I mean, she has some personalized elements, but we really only see her as a representative of the mental institution as a greater idea. And if she is that, if that's what we're going to decide, then I don't see how there's room for her to be much like an individual, because it's a lot of your individual is RP McMurphy versus your institution, which is the mental institution and Ratched. And so when you talk about the well, I don't see like the nuance in her actions, and I interpret that in my viewing that I agree, I don't really see a lot of nuance in her actions, but I also don't see any nuance in mental institutions' actions. I mean, they lobotomize the freaking dude. That's not nuanced at all. That's brain death. And so for something that, he did some bad stuff, but arguably he doesn't really deserve. And so that's where I get to see this. It's not nuanced, but it's a more complicated representation of both Ratched as a character and the mental institution as an idea.
I agree with that. I think that's really, really astute, and I wasn't really thinking about the idea of her not having the space to have these characterized elements, but I think that then that returns to where I kind of began with the idea of maybe this film is not that deep, really. I think it's an interesting portrayal in this sort of allegorical way of this bigger struggle, but ultimately it feels like here is a one-sentence theme that is represented in this way, and then instead the strength becomes the acting, it becomes the script, it becomes those little camera movements and all of these things that coalesce in an enjoyable film. But ultimately, if what I leave with is Jack Nicholson was really great, and this is the movie, what it's telling me, I'm not sure that really stands up, in my opinion, not to show my hand as to where I'm going to rank it, against a lot of these other more multi-layered films.
Sure. If I may push back on that just a little bit, I'd say that yeah, I don't think it brands itself as being an incredibly deep film, and I wouldn't take that stance either. I think that you can explore the more quote unquote shallow thematic meaning of it, but I think it's the compelling nature with which the performances and the filmmaking and all of these other aspects of filmmaking convey that theme that makes it so compelling and makes it one of if I may show my hand, one of my personal favorites.
I have said, sorry to cut you off, but really quickly, I think it's really fun to watch, right?
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
contention is mostly issues in hindsight and issues in the fact that we are contextualizing all these films against each other as the best picture, right? But through its own light, I was having a great time. I'm a big phone checker and break taker during a lot of Quest movies, but this one really did capture my attention from beginning to end in a lot of respects.
Sure.
I did have to take a break to make myself some lunch, but I also agree with you, Abram.
Yeah, and I regardless of all of the criticisms I've levied against the shallowness of the themes alongside Abram and the shallowness of Nurse Ratched's character alongside Abram, I still think this is a very good movie. I think it has great filmmaking. I think across the board the performances are fantastic. For me, the highlights are when you get those cutaway shots to different people reacting to these tense situations, and they're usually just making some sort of funny face, but you can see the emotion that they're going for. Of course, McMurphy, you got a lot of fun reaction shots from him where he's just screwing up his face into all sorts of different contortions, and you're like, all right, this guy is off the walls, but I kind of love him for it. It's a really engaging and entertaining film. I think for me, having it being the second time that I saw it and having read the book, I think it'll lose a little bit of the impact on those big climactic moments like Chief throwing the sink through the window or going out on the boat. Those I'm like, okay, I know what to expect and I can see what it's leading up to, so it's not as exciting to see them come to fruition. But I don't really see that too much as a criticism. It just reframed the way that I watched the film in terms of my excitement and engagement of it in the moment. But it's still, again, is one of those movies that I respect a lot. I don't know how much I'm going to think about it after we finish this. I'll see it on top favorite list, top best picture lists, and be like, yeah, sure, I can see why people like it. But I do think for me, it's missing that depth. It's missing the nuance of the dynamic between Ratched and McMurphy that I think could have been explored in a couple more interesting ways. But and on the whole, Milos Forman, I don't know how to pronounce this goddamn name.
It's Milos.
Milos Forman. he did a great job. He's a good director, and I'm excited to see what he does with Amadeus, because he also won Best
Oh,
Picture for that.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I've received some numbers and I've got a vote for us. I got a calculation. The number, are you ready? I'm gonna say it.
Mhm.
If you couldn't guess, we're a little spread out on this one. We have a pretty
Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, he's going to say it. Get ready. Hunker down.
we have a pretty wide-ranging amount of votes, but the number is where it's going as of right now is 12.25. So that's at 13th place, pushing down All About Eve. So it would possibly sit in between The Best Years of Our Lives and All About Eve. Now, the vote breakdown is very interesting. Tucker and Tanner both have it at 17. I have it at 10, and Tanner has it at number 5.
Okay. Yeah,
Abram.
you said.
Oh,
yeah,
I
you said
said- I
Abrams the
have
first
17.
time.
I meant yes.
I have it at number 5.
Yes, that is correct. Abrams got it at.
Crap.
So that's a pretty wide range.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Honestly, realizing this through you guys talking about Nurse Ratched, the depth of her character being one of the best villains of all time, funny enough that it's pushing down All About Eve, because for me, Eve is one of the greater movie villains of all time. And I said that as Tanner and I were watching it. I think the nuance of her performance, and maybe that's framing the way that I'm looking at Nurse Ratched as one of the greatest villains of all time, is I think just so much more interesting and nuanced with Eve in terms of the agency that she has as the character, the depth it goes into in terms of her motivations. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting that this pushes that down, because All About Eve, one of my personal favorites of these Best Picture winners, and seeing this go so high for you, Tanner, I think is interesting, but for me, kind of surprising, because I do think that when comparing Nurse Ratched versus Eve, I really think that Eve just shines out on top. And, we're putting them next to each other, so that's really the reason I'm talking about this. But we're talking about the best of the best, and I just don't think it has the nuance to warrant being any place higher. I mean, it's slightly higher than where I put it, which is fine. We have to concede. But Abram and I clearly have a bond there. Let's get the handshake going.
If I can jump off of that, I related this film a lot to Platoon, because I think both are similar in certain respects. Their thematic material is kind of surface level, but it's the feel of the film as you're watching them. In Platoon, it's the visceral war sequences. Here, it's the script and Jack Nicholson's performance. I think they're fairly similar. But when you look at things like Midnight Cowboy, which has such a nuanced depiction of just society, and I hate to use more Joker words in this review, as soon as I said it, but I think Midnight Cowboy, Unforgiven, Platoon is kind of the right area for this film to be in. So,
Yeah.
I mean, 12 is in the ballpark, I suppose, and if that's where
13.
we land, that's where we land. 13,
Yep.
sorry. But I think that more so around the Platoon, West Side Story area, Midnight Cowboy area, for me, sounds a little bit more accurate.
Yeah.
I will say that in thinking about this and thinking about the adaptation, I might have to say that the book is better. The book is a really good book. And because it's, I don't know how many hours it takes me to read it, but it's more than 2. You get a lot of time to delve into these
probably.
characters, and I really, I know Chief Bromden and I know all the other guys, and so you're right, Tucker, in that those moments, those very climactic moments of the film that maybe aren't so chaotic, but are like story quite important. Throwing the thing through the window is one of them. Don't quite ring as hard in the film as they do in the book, is what I'm thinking about. But as I said at the beginning, I do believe that this is a good example of an adaptation that can just be divorced from its source material entirely. I don't think they really need to be considered as a duo. You don't need to read the book to see the movie, and you don't need to see the movie if you've read the book.
Sure. Maybe my opinion is colored by, if I read the book, maybe I'd be underwhelmed too. But I just think that even though that we've said a few times that the thematic material isn't insanely deep, I think the degree to which it's executed on so well, the performances in this, just the lovable nature of all the characters and the energy that it continuously builds up and releases with its really fun chaotic sequences, and then it's more slowed down but just as nuanced and interesting dialogue sequences. I think that this is pretty much batting 100 through and through. And I can't say that for a lot of the other ones that I put it above, which pretty much explains my ranking.
Well, it sounds to me like none of us are going to budge, so we might as well just go with place number 13, put it right above All About Eve. So for our 30th film ranked, 30 films, that's quite a lot of this. That's a good,
A good third of
It's a
them.
good third of all the Best Picture winners. We've got them ranked. If you want to check it out, go to the Backlog Banter letterbox. The list is there, and it should be pretty updated. And you can check out what we thought about them, and you can see the other episodes. You're like, why is Dancing with Wolves at place number 19? Well, you click the link and learn all about it. Now, sadly, we don't get a spin this week because we had to do some figuring out last week. And so we did some shuffling around. And so next time, we're going to be talking about Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, released in 2003. Just to recap what we talked about last time before we were so rudely interrupted. We are going to be watching all three to build up to it because it's one of the only sequel, franchise films that have won Best Picture. Maybe the only one.
Nope.
Did one other?
There's a pretty notable one that won Best Picture.
There is a pretty notable one that won Best Picture, which we've already talked about.
Yeah.
But we're watching the theatrical versions and we're going to watch them all the way through. And we're going to have something to say. We'll have a lot of time to talk about, it's going to be, most of the time we get, 2 hours to about 3.5 hours of film to talk about. This time, it's going to be like 9 hours of film.
Incredible stuff.
To discuss as the whole. I'm really excited. I can't wait to talk about Return of the King. But this was a fun and interesting discussion, I think. Came in, I was a little head empty, but I've been a bit delirious the last couple of days, so it's okay. But you did stimulate my brain, and I thank you for that.
Like 5 gum. Stimulate your senses.
So we will be back next time. Make sure to hit like and subscribe and rate it 5 stars and do all the stuff that we'd like you to do. And we'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.
So long.